Howdy folks, this video is about whether the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis had better sports games. Indeed, you see, whenever I see discussions about this genre between these two 16-bit consoles, people always seem to automatically say, yeah, Genesis has the better sports games. And, well, I wanted to find out how true that was. This excited me a lot. And so in this video, we're going to go into an in-depth analysis of which games were actually better on which system and when they appeared. So basically there are three segments in this video where I first go through the years chronologically, like some kind of battle going on between the two of them to see who was ahead in each category. And then in the second part, I'm going to be talking about, well, let's say you're a retro gamer now and you want to go just start collecting which system would now be better for you to get into. And then in the third part, I'm going to tell you about how I did my research and some musings and other additional stuff. So let's go find out who won the console war when it comes to sports games. Now, just to be clear, I'm only going to focus on the 5 major sports games in this video. In this case, I'm talking about baseball, basketball, football, American football, ice hockey, and soccer, football for the rest of the world. The reason why I chose those 5 is because they did much better sales-wise than any of the other games. Also, I could find a lot more articles written about them. So there seems to be quite a different gap, and I don't think many people really cared that much about which system had the better tennis game or boxing game. But I will let you know that according to my research, the Super Nintendo had Super Tennis, but the Genesis did have Pete Sampras Tennis. Both of them were great. When it came to boxing, you had Greatest Heavyweights by Sega, which was really cool as a simulation, but the Super Nintendo had Super Punch-Out. I didn't include racing games because not only were there a lot of them, also it's kind of hard to find the division between those you would consider sports and which ones you would consider fantasy. And I would say that when it comes to more realistic racing games, maybe the Genesis has the advantage, but the fantasy racing games, like Super Mario Kart, Rock and Roll Racing, Street Racer, there was F-Zero, of course. The Super Nintendo definitely had better racing games when you didn't really want to stick to sports racing games, but I couldn't really find out which one was which. And I don't think that many of them, except Super Monaco for the Genesis, were that very popular. And is Top Gear a fantasy or sports racing game? I don't know. Racing games, kind of a similar thing. A lot of them were released, and I don't know how much you could really consider them a sport. Nevertheless, most people agree that both systems had most of the good wrestling games, except the Genesis had a better version of WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game, one that's kind of like Mortal Kombat, and the Super Nintendo had a better version of Capcom's Saturday Night Slam Masters. So again, kind of even if you ask me. And of course, there's also volleyball and snooker and summer games. I'm just not going to get into that because it's too hard to find out which of them really mattered. So just those 5 sports for now. Okay, so if you go back in time, of course the Genesis was released 2 years earlier than the Super Nintendo, and in those 2 years, the Genesis tried to promote itself as, I would say, a more mature system than the Nintendo. And one of the ways it did so was by having celebrities as part of their lineup. So you had Michael Jackson in the action game, but the sports games had folks like Joe Montana and Buster Douglas, Pat Riley for basketball. And for children, that made these games seem like something that would be for adults, and that was actually quite exciting. That made these kids feel like they were maturing into a better system. And so most of these celebrities were sports celebrities, and Sega not only had its own, let's say, developers for sports games, but they heavily promoted it being the sports console. And I think that gave a lot of people the idea that it would be automatically better for sports. Now, was that the case? Well, if you look at those 2 years before the Super Nintendo was released until late 1991, excuse me, you'll see that the Genesis released a couple of sports games, but they weren't that much better than the Nintendo games, if you ask me. You had Tommy Lasorda Baseball, for example, and it looked really great, but it played kind of like RBA Baseball, which was very common at the time. In 1990, they had Pat Riley Basketball, which played a lot like Double Dribble, even with the animations for the dunks. So that wasn't that much better, except better graphics. Now football was a bit different though, because you had John Madden Football released in 1990, and that was a big one. It looked fantastic, played nicely, it had a lot of plays. So that made a big difference. On the other hand, I wouldn't even say it was the biggest football game at the time, because the Nintendo had Tecmo Bowl released a year earlier, and that was just as much fun. It also had the real players and teams. So now the Genesis wasn't that popular until late 1991 sales wise. So I didn't know that many people knowing Madden, having Madden, to be honest. Everybody was playing Tecmo Bowl though. But nevertheless, Madden was a big thing. It sold very well. There wasn't a hockey game yet. And when it comes to soccer, there was only one for, I believe, in the first 2 years. It was called World Championship Soccer, which had the camera straight top to bottom. And I think it was called Italia in 1990 in Europe, and played very normal. There were a lot of soccer games like this at the time, like Kickoff and Microprose Soccer, and it wasn't that special. Was it better than what was on the NES? Well, actually, it was, but it's more because the NES didn't have that many good soccer games in 1989. Although in 1990, it did feature a goal with an exclamation point and the more famous World Cup Soccer by Nintendo, which had the Ni Kuni guys, with fists. That game had a lot of personality, and I think turned out to be more popular. So by the time the Super Nintendo was released, the Genesis did have 4 good sports games released, but only one of them actually really stuck out, namely Madden. The other were just nice to have, and probably did make you feel like, yeah, I have evolved into better games. But well, we're going to soon find out if the Super Nintendo, already in 1991, could make up that difference. So I have a bit of a list here. I'm going to go down. And in late 1991, more games were released, of course. The Genesis ended up getting Hardball, which was a popular simulation baseball game on the PC. And that was on Genesis, and it was fine, but a lot of people didn't like the way it played. It's a bit slow, too. On the Super Nintendo, they had Super Bases Loaded, just like the one on Nintendo, and it's not that very good. It's more or less the same, actually, and hardly even looks better. But what the Super Nintendo did get was Super Baseball Simulator 1000. Yes, this one sounds like a simulation, but actually it's the opposite. This game has a lot of power-ups, so it's kind of like the NBA Jam of baseball games, and a lot of people enjoyed it. I mean, the overall play wasn't that special, but the fact that you could throw like a fireball pitch or whatever, or like a leaf pitch to slow that down, and there's some really funny ways of batting. Yeah, they gave the game a bit more diversity, and a lot of people enjoyed that. And I can't really say whether Tommy the Sword or Hardball or Simulator 1000 would be the best. Now, 1990, then you had, let's see, basketball. No games for either new systems released in 1991, so that's still only Pat Riley. But the football game, Madden 92, that's an interesting case. The Genesis version improved, mostly because of multiplayer. And of course, it had the ambience, which would ride into the screen and knock over players. And the Super Nintendo got the same game, but it had a very bad frame rate and very choppy animation. You could easily see the difference. And that was quite a shame for Super Nintendo owners. Now, Madden 92 was an excellent game, no matter what, but it played much more fluid on the Genesis. So that was the better version, and I would give it like a 5 out of 5 stars in terms of quality. The Super Nintendo version, it's still a good game though. In all fairness, it still had the same options. It looked good. It sounded well. It was a good football game, but I think this is where people started realizing, okay, there's a difference between these two consoles. I think it was the first game on both consoles being released, and this animation thing would hamper a lot of sports games for the Super Nintendo, especially the ones made by Electronic Arts. I do have to note, though, that in 1991, they also released Super Tecmo Bowl, or Tecmo Super Bowl, TSP, and that game was much bigger than Madden, and it improved on the Tecmo Bowl in all kinds of different ways. Put more players on the field, and I still think it's the most loved retro sports game of all time. I mean, a lot of tournaments still being played. And if you had a Super Nintendo, you probably had a Nintendo, even if you had Genesis, actually. And your favorite sports game was still probably Tecmo Super Bowl, and not the latest Madden. Although I think you should have had both if you were into football. But yeah, with this, the clear distinction that Genesis was ahead on the Super Nintendo when it comes to quality of sports. Hockey also biggie because EA released its first hockey game, namely NHL Hockey, and not for Super Nintendo. And this was huge. This was better than Blades of Steel or Ice Hockey for Nintendo because it was realistic and fun at the same time. Great graphics, sound, played really nice. Really felt like you were ice skating. And this would start the series that's still going on, as far as I know. So fantastic game, and not on the Super Nintendo. So that's 2 points ahead for the Genesis. And when it comes to soccer, nothing new. So World Championship Soccer for the Genesis if you really needed one. So here we have the case where, the Genesis was ahead in sports games for the first Christmas season they competed. But what about a year later? Because by now the Super Nintendo had a year to catch up. Most of the developers had now finished their product, and 1992 was an awesome year for the Super Nintendo. I mean, we're talking Street Fighter II, which was huge. You cannot underestimate that. I mean, it was on the cover of every magazine multiple times. Zelda 3, of course. Super Contra. What else did we have? Super Mario Kart, of course. Super Star Wars was also really cool. I could go on. 1992 was a fantastic year for the Super Nintendo, and if you ask me, by Christmas 1992, the Super Nintendo actually even had a better lineup than the Genesis. Not that much better, but still better. And what about sports then? Well, we got some new baseball games. The Genesis got Sports Talk Baseball, which is probably still the best arcade-like baseball game on the Genesis. It had the Sports Talk, which some people really love, but maybe didn't. But it played really well, kind of like souped up RBI baseball. Speaking of which, the Super Nintendo also got 2 baseball games that year, which are worth noting. They both play quite similar, actually. Namely, you have Extra Innings, which also looks a lot like RBI baseball, the round heads and all that. It's all really cute. But you also have Super Batter Up, which look more realistic. These are both very quality baseball games. The perfect kind of baseball game you like to play if you just want to have a quick game with all the interesting choices and all that. And I can't really say which is better between Sports Talk and the other two. I guess it kind of depends on how much you really like that Sports Talk ability on the Genesis, which, well, I think it's kind of hit or miss, even though it was pretty cool. So I would say when it comes to baseball, of course, you had Super Simulator 1000 still on the Super Nintendo. So I would say that console had a slight edge because you had more choice among quality titles. But if you just wanted one really good one, it didn't matter which console you had. On to basketball. Now, NCAA basketball was released, and that was probably the best Mode 7 sports game on the Super Nintendo, and it got great scores in all magazines, and I think it plays really well. And that was something really special. There's nothing quite like that for the Genesis. Oh, actually, no. What's the name of the announcer? A couple years later, this Dick. God, I can't remember his name. They tried to release something like that on Genesis, but it did not work. It just doesn't work very well. Nevertheless, if you look at the games in 1992, they also had now Bulls versus Lakers for the Genesis, and I think there's a Super Nintendo version, although it's not very clear online. This game is made by Electronic Arts, based on the same engine you saw in Latex versus Celtics, which I forgot to mention previously. That was actually released a year earlier, and you could tell that it's based on a PC game. It has a very choppy animation. It's slow. What's good about it is that you can actually identify the players with the numbers on their backs, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has the goggles on. That was pretty cool. Players had their own signature moves, like most famously Tom Chambers with a dunk from the free throw line. But the most people didn't really like these games that much. They're just too slow. They're plodding. And but if you wanted a basketball simulation, you could get one on the Genesis with Bulls versus Lakers. But I would say NCAA basketball was a better game. On to football, we now have John Madden 93, which did improve the frame rate a little bit on the Super Nintendo, but still it was better on the Genesis. And so yeah, go Genesis, another year of better Madden. Now on to hockey. We now have NHLPA 93, which had a lot of little improvements over the previous one. And the Genesis played perfectly smoothly and was a huge hit. The Super Nintendo version didn't have quite the frame rate again, so that hurt the game. The Genesis version was obviously better. And so here again, we see these two Electronic Arts games, also the two most popular sports games at the time, just being better on Genesis. Still, NHLPA 93 on the Super Nintendo is still a good hockey game, just like Madden 93 being a good football game. I mean, if you had this as a kid, you would be very happy with it. It'd be really nice. The thing is, you'd be bummed out if you went to a friend's house and saw more fluid animation at theirs. Okay, and then let's look at soccer. Now, the Super Nintendo got Super Soccer, which also used some kind of Mode 7 effects. It has a funny camera angle, but it played really well, and it was quite popular, Super Soccer. Yeah, very good soccer game. Had a unique perspective, and if you want to have a fun game of football, that would be definitely the best. Genesis, though, had World Trophy Soccer, also known as European Club Soccer in Europe, and that lets you play like a lot of teams, and it looked very realistic. It was slow and simple, though, but it definitely had a better camera than World Championship Soccer. So that became the new best soccer game on the Genesis. And here we see a trend we see often on these different consoles that I would say go for World Trophy Soccer for the Genesis if you want to have a more realistic game of soccer. But if you want to have more fun, go for the Super Nintendo's Super Soccer. All right, so by the second Christmas season, they were competing. The Genesis had the two best sports games, namely Madden and NHPL. The Super Nintendo did have NCAA basketball and Super Soccer, which were cool, and also these EA games. So you basically had good sports games across the field for both systems, but Genesis was obviously better for the best games, and I think that's why Genesis started getting this, started being known as the better console for sports games. Now, let's go on to 1993, which I like to consider a year where the Genesis did better, with Aladdin and Gunstar Heroes and all that. There just weren't that many good Super Nintendo games, too. So What about baseball games? And well, the Genesis got Hardball 3, which is more hardball simulation, and also Tony La Russa, which was a Electronic Arts baseball game. But most people agree that neither of these were as good as Sports Talk Baseball. So not many improvements here, just more choice. As for basketball, well, now we got an interesting basketball game for both systems, namely Tecmo Super NBA Basketball. Yeah, this was kind of like Double Dribble, but even nicer. And looking into my research, the SNES version got better reviews because of the graphics and sound, but in my opinion, they're kind of alike. So I'm not going to say either of them was better. So that kind of replaced Pat Riley's basketball as the best basketball game on the Genesis. But the Super Nintendo also got another game, namely NBA Showdown. This was released in 1994 for the Genesis, but we're looking at the Christmas season of 1993. And NBA Showdown was a faster version of Electronics Arts Versus series. Yes, it was faster. It played nicer, although defense is kind of tight. But this game also featured a lot of trading players and all that. So this easily became the best simulation-like basketball game for all systems. And well, it's clear the Super Nintendo had a better choice because on the Genesis you had Tecmo NBA Basketball and Bull versus Blazers, but nothing like NCAA basketball. And like I said, Showdown was better than Bulls versus Blazers, mostly because of the speed. So yeah, if you cared about basketball, the Super Nintendo was better. And when it came to football, though, Madden 94, by now on the Super Nintendo, it was made by other people and it had a good frame rate. And critics basically considered both versions equal. Yeah. So now we had a very good football game for the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. But interestingly, though, also there was Sega's NFL 94, the Joe Montana series. The first couple versions, they were cute. There was one with the Sports Talk and pretty cool graphics. Nice, but most people agreed that Madden was better. But the 1994 version, NFL 94, yeah, for some people, this was better than Madden. So, even though it's not everybody agrees on that, at least if you had a Genesis, you had a choice between Madden and Joe Montana. And there's another game that really helped the Genesis, namely Mutant League Football, which was a lot of fun. This is where you play with, indeed, mutants, and there are obstacles, like booby traps on the field and all that. You can kill players. It was all outrageous. Never released for the Super Nintendo, so that was really cool if you were a Genesis person. And also there was Bill Walsh College Football for the Genesis, not yet released for the Super Nintendo. Used the Madden engine. And this had a different kind of playbook with a lot more options, which a lot of people liked. So if you didn't care about using NFL players, some people actually said go for Bill Walsh. You could have more fun with the things you could do on the field. Also worth mentioning is, of course, Tecmo Super Bowl, now released for both systems. People tend to prefer the Super Nintendo version. I think that's because, it's always been like a Nintendo thing, because I think they both look great. This is more for arcade-style football. And it's excellent. It plays a lot like the Nintendo version. So if you want a Tecmo Bowl action on your Genesis, you can now get that. If you want on the Super Nintendo, same too. And I think it's pretty clear that, the choice on the Genesis was simply more quality. So even though as a Super Nintendo player, you would be very content with the simulation like Madden and the arcade like Tecmo Bowl, you'd have at least Mutant League Football and Bill Walsh on the Genesis, and otherwise NFL 94. Now, NHL 94, well, this is a biggie, because this is probably for Americans the most popular retro sports game, and I spent a lot of time finding out which one was actually better, because the Super Nintendo version plays very well. It has good animation. Some people complain that the Super Nintendo version has less good controls, and I think that has to do with people being used to the controls in NHLPL 93. The thing is, both versions of NHL 94 are still being played online in tournaments. Both games have quite a big following still, which is awesome. And if you go to like NHL94.com, you can find that's where people organize to play against each other. You'll see multiple forum threads discussing which of the two is better, and there's no general consensus. They're both great. You can find players to play against for both, but I will admit the Genesis seems to have more, probably because the Genesis is known as the sports console, and it probably sold better on the Genesis. So for that reason, I would advise somebody to go for the Sega version if you had to choose, because it's easier to find people, but not by that much. They're both great, and maybe I haven't done that much research, but some people even say that the emulator used for NHL 94 on the Super Nintendo is better for internet play. I'll leave that up to you if you really care, okay? But both of these games are really great. I can't say that either of them is better in a vacuum, but you might consider the Genesis to easier to find, more easily find people to play with. Okay, on to soccer. Yes, so FIFA was released for the Genesis, not for the Super Nintendo, and it looked great. Excellent simulation game. But the Super Nintendo also got a great soccer game, namely, well, everybody calls it Striker here in Europe, but it's called World Cup Soccer 94. Yeah, all these soccer games have these extremely generic names, hard for me to remember. Luckily, I have this list with me. And World Soccer 94, which I'll just call Striker from now on. It's fast-paced. It's just really nice to play. You should check it out. It was a better arcade soccer game, definitely. So again, simulation if you want Genesis, arcade if you want the Super Nintendo. But there's also Tony Meola Sidekick Soccer, not released in Europe. Though some people call it like Worldwide Soccer or something. Yeah, this game used the Mode 7 effects, so that was kind of cool. And I've been playing it actually just to make sure how good it is, because there isn't that much information written on this. Like I said, I don't think it was released in Europe, so it's very hard to find reviews for it. And Americans aren't that into soccer. GamePro loved it; they gave it like 5 out of 5. I think it's a bit weird, but the perspective works. Unlike any other soccer game, I feel like I'm really on the pitch. And concerned about the players around me. In that sense, I really like it. It does work well. And there's nothing like that on the Genesis. But I'd say for overall quality, Striker and FIFA were better, though. Yeah. All right. So I know there's also a Mode 7 hockey game. I'm just thinking, was it released in 93 or 94? I think 94. Yeah. Called NHL Stanley Cup or something. Another generic name. We'll get back to that later. Okay, sticking to 93. Well, we reviewed most of the important ones of that year. And which one had the better games? Well, baseball is pretty much a tie. Hockey is pretty much a tie. Soccer is pretty much a tie. But the Genesis had better football games, and or at least more good ones. And the SNES had better basketball games. Considering how football was more popular than basketball on the consoles at the time, I'd say Genesis still had a slight nod, but really, if you had either of these systems, it really wouldn't matter that much. You could have a lot of great sporting titles. So this is going to be the end of this part of the video because I'm running out of time. Next time, we're going to see how well 1994 1995 go.